Hello and welcome to this opening explorations video, and today we'll be exploring the Jobava London. So this is mostly for beginners and maybe some intermediate players, but if you're not familiar with the Jobava London, it is d4 with white, and then black can play d5 or knight to f6 even, but here's the setup you're trying to go for. d4, d5, knight to c3, and then, after they play maybe knight to f6, you play bishop to f4. So, something that's a little bit different. This is kind of like a London system, but it's the Jobava London. So we notice how this knight has moved to c3, which blocks this pawn, but you develop this knight more quickly. A lot of times in the regular London, the knight could be moved later to d2, and a lot of times you'll have the knight to f3 here, and then maybe this pawn moves to c4 or c3, but one of the reasons that you want to bring this knight up here to c3 early and the bishop to f4 is that you may be able to jump the knight to b5 and target this c7 pawn along with the bishop here. And you may have a chance for a fork if your opponent makes a mistake. You can fork the king and the rook, or maybe your opponent might be forced to play his knight to a6 on the edge of the board to cover this square. So it would kind of bind up the queen side here for black. But let's take a look in this database to see what some of the common moves are in this Jobava London. And we see here, even the database calls this the Queen's Pawn Opening Shigorin variation. So the Jobava London is a newer opening, compared to many other openings that have been around for, 100 years or hundreds of years even. This is a fairly newer opening. And so here in this position, it looks like e6 is a possibility, and that's the most played move, a6, or even c5 immediately. So e6, of course, helps back up this d pawn and allows you to develop your bishop. And then a6 is an important move. If black plays this pawn here to a6, well, that kind of keeps that knight from being able to jump to b5, as we mentioned earlier, piling up on the c pawn with the bishop. c5 is another possibility, and then c6, of course, which covers the pawn in the center and covers the b5 square. So I guess we could take a look at e6 here first. So here, e6, it looks like, if I go back, that move is played the most along with a6, pawn to a6, or c5. So with e6, now it looks like the most played move is to immediately jump up here to b5. So as I mentioned, you jump to b5, pile up on the pawn here with the bishop. So now it looks like most often played is knight to a6, although bishop to b4 is played as well. So we could take a quick look at that, but first, knight to a6. So the knight is stuck here on the edge of the board, guarding this pawn. And now what do they recommend? e3. So in this position, the knight has jumped forward, piling up with the bishop on this c7 pawn. Now you play e3, another common move in this opening, because it guards the bishop. And sometimes the knight will move and attack this bishop, And then you can actually let this bishop be captured, and then the e pawn will recapture, and you'll have a pawn on f4 and d4, and that kind of locks down this e5 square. Because in this opening, often the dark squares on e5 and c5, it's important for white to try and control those. So let's see here. If that is played, now it looks like c6, just attacking the knight. So this is one downside to bringing this knight here too early, because now it's just going to be chased away back to c3. And then black can reposition this knight maybe back towards the center. It looks like knight to c7 is played most often. So something like that. All right, so let's go back a little bit. We'll go back a few moves here after the initial bishop to f4 position. So it looks like a6 and c5 are also played quite often. So a6, a good move. It immediately stops any future threats of this knight jumping forward and putting pressure on the c7 square. So now white should just continue with e3. And so if you're thinking about learning this Jobava London opening, which I'm still learning this opening myself, good ways to kind of learn an opening initially and then improve on that opening is to play through games by the masters from a database. So we could take a look at some of these games after we look at these opening moves. But then you can go through a database like this and just see what is played most often, and then check your moves with the computer, of course, because sometimes that move that's played often could be a mistake. So let's see here. After e3, so like I said, that's an important move to cover your bishop and to bolster this d pawn. Now, it looks like e6 is played most often, so we could take a look at that. And then now, the number one move is g4. So, that's interesting. An immediate kingside attack, beginning with this g4 move. And now we have the number one move, c5. So another common move by black in this opening is to strike back at white's center with this flank pawn. And let's see, now the number one played move is just to immediately attack the knight. The knight would retreat and also keep an eye on this pawn in case white captures. And here it looks like knight to f3 is played most often. h4 can be played. You can just start marching these pawns up towards the kingside because that's probably where black is going to end up, is castling on the kingside, especially once these pawns have been moved here on the queen side. So the number one played moves looks like knight to f3 is played most often, although these other moves have a higher white win percentage, although this is not very many games, so we don't know the full story behind this. If only a few games have been played, we don't know exactly how good these h4, queen to g4, queen to f3 moves are. But the queen moves could at least allow you to develop your queen and get ready to castle kingside, which would get your king to safety and then bring a rook to the center. But the number one move in this position, it looks like, is knight to f3, and then knight to c6, and we could play this out a little bit further. And now this h4 move, then what do we have? b5. So it looks like an attack starts commencing here on the queen side by black. But you get the idea. So let's go back a little bit here and take another look at this. So after bishop to f4, the initial Jobava London position, what did we look at? e6, a6. We could look at this immediate c5 move. So if that is played, let's see here. What would be best? Now, you think maybe I want to jump up and attack immediately, but you have to watch out for this possible queen to a5 check. So if your knight jumps up here, the queen could go ahead and check, and then attack the knight. So what do you do then? You probably have to just retreat that knight back. So the most common move here is e3, because now this bishop on f1 could cover the knight on, if the knight jumps up to b5 and the queen moves to a5, checking the king and attacking the knight, well, then the knight will be protected by this bishop on f1, and you could just block the attack with a c3 pawn push. So it looks like in this position, the most common move now is to capture, and then you want to recapture with the pawn. That way the pawns are even here in the center. And this important d4 pawn kind of holds the pawn structure together here in the center. Now we do see that white has one central pawn compared to two for black. But going on here, now the top move is a6 to keep the knight from jumping forward and threatening a fork up here. So now, let's see, knight to f3 is a common move. Knight to c6 is the most played move. And now it looks like knight to e5 is pretty common. So that's interesting. At some point you may want to put this bishop on d3 here. Of course the knight could attack. So knight to e5, and now we have what? Bishop to d7 is most played. And so what does this do? Well, black could give up the bishop pair, but they might not be too worried about losing this bishop, because it's a bad bishop on the same color squares as his central pawn, especially if he moves this pawn up to e6 and really blocks this bishop in. So the most played move next is bishop to e2, maybe keeping the knight from being able to move forward in the future, not moving to d3, in case the knight decides to attack. And then we have e6, castling kingside, maybe queen to b6, so adding pressure here, and now capture. So capture, bishop captures, and rook to b1, just guarding the pawn. So another way that this Jobava London could play out. So and if we go all the way back to d4, so what we looked at was d4, d5, knight to c3, knight to f6, and then bishop to f4. The game could transpose to that. Let's say you play d4, and then they play knight to f6. Well, then you can still play this knight to c3 move, and now you're threatening to put both pawns in the center and grab control of the center. So they'll probably play d5, and it looks like that was the most often played move by far, was just a d5 move here. And then now of course you can just play your bishop to f4 move. So let's see, what else should we take a look at here? we could look at, what if they attack immediately? If we have something like this, well, now the computer recommends keeping your bishop pair by going bishop to e5. One possibility, could maybe be that you play e3, and then if they capture, you recapture, and then you're controlling the dark e5 square with both pawns. But it looks like, even then, this is not played very often because it's generally not a good idea to move your pawn to the edge of the board here. So, if you play this move, which is played most often, now that could allow the chasing of this bishop, and now what? This is interesting, I guess. e4 was played here. And then after g6, bishop back to g3, and then if the knight captures, you could capture towards the center and have an open or a half open file for your rook. All right, so that was just an idea of how the game could start out differently with d4 and then the knight move, and then you steer it back into the Jobava London like this. And then at this point, we're back to the normal moves. So if we go all the way back here, so if d5 is played, and then you play knight to c3, and they'll probably, once again play knight to f6 to prevent you from bringing both pawns into the center here. So knight to f6, bishop to f4. Let's say they play this a6 move to keep you, to stop any future threats of the knight jumping forward. Well, now you just play e3. Looks like e6 is a common move. But let's take a look at this. Bishop to f5. So this move can happen quite a bit. Now, the options are, we see f3 is the most played move. You could play knight to f3, knight to f3, or bishop to d3. But let's take a look at this f3 move. So this can, one, keep pieces out of e4 or g4, but now you're threatening to start attacking on the king side with a g4 pawn push. So here we could have e6 being played next. Looks like that was most common. And now g4. So you start chasing the bishop back, and then you just keep going. Now you're threatening to trap the bishop. So black has to play h5 or h6. Looks like, maybe h5 is played more often. And now you can just chase the knight. So the knight usually goes here, and then bishop to d3. So here the bishops are usually exchanged, and then the queen will recapture. But white has gained a lot of space on the king side, and if black castles over there, he may be able to use this space advantage to, aid an attack on black's king side. So now, the game could continue with the c5, the common move of attacking this strong d4 pawn with the flank pawn. And then, let's see, this is interesting. g6 is played in this position sometimes, so it looks like that's the most played move. I guess we could take a look at that. If they capture, well, then your queen is going to capture and check the king, so you don't really want to allow that. So it looks like f5 or f6 is played. Apparently f6 is played a little bit more often, because now maybe in the future you could threaten to push this e pawn and it'll be backed up by the f pawn. But in this database, it's saying knight at g to e2 is played most here, and now we're down to just 3 games. So maybe they play this, the knight develops, and now we have a3 to keep the knight from jumping forward and attacking our queen. Queen to b6, and let's see. Now the recommendation is bishop back down to h2 here. But in that game, black won. So, I don't know. This pawn is under attack. You could go ahead maybe and castle queenside. That's a possibility. But I'm not going to dig too deep into this since it's just a little bit of exploration on this opening. So I'm not going to go too crazy. Let's see, what else is there to take a look at here? So back to the Jobava London initial setup. Let's see. What have we not looked at? I guess we could take a look at this. Once again, if black doesn't do anything too crazy, you just continue with normal moves. This e3 move is common. Now, let's see. Once again, now they're showing the bishop to f5 move because they want to bring their bishop outside of this pawn chain. So, we could take a look at that. And then, of course, you're back to the f3 move. Now they can play e6, g4, and it's starting to look like, similar to what we checked out before. They have to retreat. You threaten to trap them. Now we could look at, instead of h5, maybe we look at this move. The recommendation is maybe bishop to d3, capture, and now another common theme is when black develops their bishop and attacks your bishop here. So this move could be played. So if they capture, you could recapture with the knight. So they have the option to play this, and now they're just putting a little bit more pressure on that bishop, but now you have the knight here to help cover that. So white could go ahead and capture or castle to the queen side. And it looks like most of the time white castles. And now a developing move. And here g5 could be played, attacking the knight. So knight to h5, targeting the bishop. So capture, and now let's see. Looks like g6 is played. So once again, there's that theme of moving forward here, threatening to attack, and kind of try and open a line up towards the queen. Towards the king, and maybe the queen could, eventually move over here, attack the knight at some point. Now, let's see. We could look at this f5 move. That kind of leaves a backward pawn on e6, so that could be an issue maybe. But looks like that's played most often, but there's only 3 games left. So now e4, knight to f4, and then queen to e3, lining up on the king here. So capture, knight captures. Now this knight has moved away and frees up the push, possible push of this pawn to either c3, or maybe even c4 at some point. and then we have a castle to the queen side, e5, just grabbing space. But you get the idea. Another way that this game could play out, this opening, the Jobava London. All right, let's go back here, see if there's anything else we need to take a look at. So I was wondering if you play d4 and then they play d5, knight to c3. What if they play this immediately? Well, now it looks like the recommendation is to just play e4. So then, if they capture, your queen captures, and now, looks like there's only 2 games. They could either capture your pawn here, but it looks like white is probably going to go up material here. Let's see. If they attack your queen with knight to c6, you could even just move, capture this pawn here. So, I don't know, we could look at both of these. So capture, then you just go ahead and capture. King has to capture, of course, and then you just pick off this pawn here. So, are we even? So it looks like we're even material here. 6 pawns versus 6, but there is a pawn majority on the queen side here. So then what? Bishop to f5, bishop to d3. Then you could capture or just push this pawn. Anyway, so that is one way that it could have gone. So what was the other option? If they attack your queen, well then now you can just pick this pawn off. So, then what? Bishop to d7 was played, knight to f3, and it looks like Levon Aronian was playing with the white pieces here. One of the top chess masters or grandmasters in the world, and he won this game. We could play it out a little bit further. So another attack on the queen. He retreated back. Then we had e5, kind of equalizing in the center a little bit. Bishop to d3, bishop to b4, bishop to d2, castle, h3, kind of keeping pieces out of g4. Rook d8, lining up on the king. Knight to e2, capture, queen captures, queen to b6, and then c3, keeping the knight out of b4, d4, also guarding this b2 pawn from the queen's attack now. And then rook at a to d8, queen to c2, so kind of lining up on this h7 pawn, if the center clears out. So moving and lining up on the queen, queen to b3, tempting black to trade, but if we had a capture of this queen, the pawn could capture towards the center, maybe put a little bit of pressure on this a7 pawn and have a half open file. So queen trade is avoided, and now kingside castling. And so the game continued with an attack on the queen. Queen retreats, b5, knight to g5, attacking the bishop. Bishop to c4, and now knight to f3. And capture, capture, b4, takes, takes. Now the queen's under attack. Queen moves. rook to a4, and knight to d2. So you're bringing the knight over to the queen side, threatening to jump up here and attack the queen. So the queen moves over, lining up on white's unprotected queen here. So we have knight to c4, a5, rook at f to a1. So piling up here, rook to a8, and knight to c1. So maybe getting ready to move here to d3 and attack the queen. Rook at e to d8, grabbing the open file. Knight up to e3. Or excuse me, d3. I made the wrong move. Knight to e3 was played in the game. Queen to d6. So grabbing control of this open d file. And now we have b4. Rook at a to c8. Capture. Knight to d4, because this pawn is pinned to the queen. So the queen moves, but this dangerous passed pawn on the a file is probably what ended up helping Levon Aronian win this game. So queen attacked by the rook, so they move, and then knight retreats because it was under attack. Knight up to b3, queen to d3, and the pawn starts moving here. So capture, pawn keeps going, rook captures, attack on the queen. Oh, did I play that move right? So rook to c4. Rook to c4. Yeah, it looks like that was played next. Rook to c4. So maybe the game ended there with Aronian winning, because now this pawn is about ready to push forward here and promote. The queen is under attack. So I don't know. It's looking a little rough for black here. All right. Well, that was an example of how this Jobava London system can play out. This was just an introduction, a little exploration of that Jobava London system opening. Let me know what you think, if you play this opening or not. If you stuck around for the video this far the whole time, I thank you. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And feel free, to leave comments on what you think about this Jobava London opening. And, if you want to see anything more with it in the future, just let me know in the comments. But thank you for watching and have a super chess day.